In 43 years of law enforcement, I've seen humanity at its darkest. I've walked through crime scenes that would make seasoned detectives lose their lunch, and I've interrogated killers whose eyes held nothing but cold calculation. But there's one case that still haunts my dreams, one that I studied obsessively long after I hung up my badge. My name is Detective Thomas Morrison, and I spent the final decade of my career investigating what might be America's first documented serial killer, a monster who terrorized Austin, Texas in 1885, nearly 2 decades before Jack the Ripper made headlines in London. They called him the Servant Girl Annihilator. Between December 1884 and December 1885, this predator stalked the night streets of Austin, systematically hunting young women with a methodical precision that would make modern profilers shudder. 8 women died at his hands, and 6 others barely survived his brutal attacks. What makes this case truly chilling isn't just the body count. It is how he operated in plain sight, how he seemed to know exactly when and where to strike, and how he vanished into history without ever being identified. The numbers alone are staggering. In a city of just 12,000 residents, 14 women were attacked in their own homes over the course of 12 months. That's a rate of violence that would shut down a modern metropolis. But in 1885 Austin, with its primitive communication systems and limited police force, the Servant Girl Annihilator operated with near impunity. He didn't just kill, he terrorized an entire community, fundamentally changing how people lived, worked, and slept. What I discovered during my investigation will challenge everything you think you know about early American crime. The evidence I uncovered suggests this wasn't a random madman. This was someone who understood police procedures, someone who had access to information about his victims' schedules, someone who moved through Austin's segregated society with disturbing ease. The more I dug into the case files, the more convinced I became that we were dealing with America's first organized serial killer, a man whose methods were so advanced that modern investigators are still studying his techniques. The terror began on New Year's Eve, 1884, in the working-class neighborhoods east of Congress Avenue. Molly Smith, a 25-year-old African-American domestic worker, was found dead in her small servants' quarters behind her employer's main house. The scene was unlike anything Austin's small police force had ever encountered. Smith had been struck repeatedly with a sharp object, later determined to be an axe, but the killer had also used a knife to mutilate her body in ways that suggested both rage and calculated cruelty. What immediately struck investigating officers was the method of entry. The killer hadn't broken down doors or smashed windows. Instead, he had somehow gained access to Smith's locked quarters without leaving obvious signs of forced entry. The first responding officer, Sergeant William Ray, noted in his report that the door showed minimal damage, suggesting the perpetrator either had a key or possessed sophisticated lockpicking skills unusual for the era. But it was the condition of the crime scene that truly disturbed investigators. The killer had arranged Smith's body in a specific position, covered parts of her with a blanket, and had taken time to clean blood from his hands using a wash basin in the room. This wasn't a crime of passion or a botched robbery. This was the work of someone who felt comfortable spending extended time at the scene, someone who wasn't afraid of being discovered. The Austin Police Department, consisting of just 8 officers led by Chief James Lucy, initially treated the murder as an isolated incident. Domestic workers, particularly African American women, were vulnerable to violence in post-Reconstruction Texas, and authorities assumed Smith's death was the result of a personal dispute or robbery gone wrong. They questioned her employer, her known associates, and conducted a cursory search of the neighborhood. No arrests were made. 3 months passed before the killer struck again. On May 6, 1885, Eliza Shelley, another African-American domestic worker, was attacked in her quarters behind the home where she worked on East Pecan Street. Unlike Molly Smith, Shelley survived the initial assault, but she died from her injuries 3 days later. Before her death, she was able to provide the first eyewitness account of the attacker. Shelley described her assailant as a tall man, well-dressed, who spoke in what she characterized as an educated manner. Most significantly, she told investigators that the man had called her by name before the attack began. This detail would prove crucial to my later analysis. The killer wasn't selecting victims at random. He was studying them, learning their routines, their names, their vulnerabilities. The third attack occurred on May 22, 1885, and this time the killer's evolving methods became clear. Irene Cross, a 17-year-old African-American girl, was found beaten and stabbed in the servants' quarters where she lived with her employer's family. But Cross survived, and her testimony provided investigators with their most detailed description of the Servant Girl Annihilator's approach. According to Cross, the attacker had been watching her residence for several days before the assault. She had noticed a well-dressed man lingering near the property, always during the early evening hours when she was preparing dinner for her employers. On the night of the attack, the man had approached her door and claimed to be looking for work. When she refused to open the door, he had somehow gained entry through a window that investigators later determined had been tampered with hours earlier. Cross's survival was purely accidental. Her screams had awakened the family in the main house, and the killer had fled before completing his attack, but the pattern was now unmistakable. The Servant Girl Annihilator was targeting African-American domestic workers, specifically those who lived in separate quarters behind their employers' homes. He was conducting surveillance before each attack, and he possessed skills that allowed him to defeat simple locks and security measures. Chief Lucy finally acknowledged that Austin had a serial killer on its hands. He increased patrols in the affected neighborhoods and issued warnings to domestic workers about traveling alone after dark. But the killer's next move would prove that he was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Now, before I continue with how this predator evolved his methods and expanded his victim profile, I need to address something important. If you're finding this case as compelling as I did during my investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What I am about to reveal about the Servant Girl Annihilator's connection to Austin's upper-class society will shock you, and you won't want to miss the evidence I uncovered that law enforcement at the time either ignored or actively suppressed. The rabbit hole goes much deeper than anyone suspected. The summer of 1885 brought a terrifying escalation. On August 30th, the killer struck twice in one night, demonstrating a level of confidence and physical stamina that suggested he was becoming more comfortable with his methods. The first victim was Rebecca Ramey, an 11-year-old African-American girl who lived with her mother Mary in servant's quarters on West Pecan Street. The second was Mary Ramey herself, Rebecca's mother. The double homicide scene was the most disturbing crime scene I've ever studied, even through century-old police reports and newspaper accounts. The killer had first attacked young Rebecca, striking her with an axe and dragging her from the quarters into the yard. When Mary Ramey attempted to protect her daughter, the killer turned on her with savage fury. Both mother and daughter were found with massive head trauma, but it was the killer's behavior after the murders that revealed his increasingly confident psychology. Neighbors reported that approximately 30 minutes elapsed between the initial screams and the discovery of the bodies. During this time, the killer had remained at the scene, moving between the yard and the servants' quarters. He had used the family's water pump to clean himself, had eaten food from their small pantry, and had even changed into clean clothes he found in their belongings. This wasn't the behavior of a panicked murderer fleeing the scene. This was someone who felt completely in control of the situation. The investigation into the Ramey murders revealed something that would fundamentally change my understanding of the case decades later. Mary Ramey had been planning to quit her position as a domestic worker. She had told several people that she was uncomfortable with her employer's behavior toward her and wanted to find work elsewhere. More significantly, she had mentioned to a neighbor that she had seen something she shouldn't have seen at her workplace. The Austin Police Department's investigation files, which I was able to access through contacts I developed during my career, contain interview notes that were never made public. 3 different witnesses reported that Mary Ramey had spoken about overhearing conversations in her employer's home that made her believe important men were involved in activities that could bring shame to their families. She had been actively seeking new employment because she feared for her safety. The timing of her murder, just days after she had given notice to her employer, was no coincidence. Someone had wanted Mary Ramey silenced, and they had used the Servant Girl Annihilator's established pattern to make her death appear to be part of the serial killer's random targeting of domestic workers. This revelation led me to examine the other victims' employment situations more closely. What I found was a pattern that investigators in 1885 had either missed or chosen to ignore. 6 of the 8 murdered women had recently changed jobs, had been planning to leave their positions, or had been involved in disputes with their employers. The Servant Girl Annihilator wasn't just a random serial killer. He was being used as cover for targeted assassinations. The killer's methods continued to evolve throughout the summer of 1885. On September 28th, he claimed his 6th victim, but this time he made a crucial mistake that would provide investigators with their first real physical evidence. Gracie Vance, a 16-year-old African-American domestic worker, fought back against her attacker with surprising effectiveness. Vance had been trained in basic self-defense by her father, a veteran of the Union Army who had remained in Austin after the Civil War ended. When the killer entered her quarters, she was ready for him. She managed to scratch his face deeply enough to draw blood and to tear a piece of fabric from his clothing before succumbing to her injuries. The fabric sample was the first physical evidence investigators had obtained. It was high-quality wool, dyed in a deep blue color that was expensive and typically associated with formal menswear. More importantly, the weave pattern was distinctive. It matched fabric that was only available from 3 clothing stores in Austin, all of which catered to wealthy clientele. Chief Lucy assigned Detective Samuel Norton to trace the fabric, but Norton's investigation was mysteriously curtailed after just 2 days. According to the police files I reviewed, Norton had identified several potential matches and was preparing to interview the customers who had purchased garments made from the fabric. On October 1st, 1885, Norton was suddenly reassigned to investigate cattle rustling in rural areas outside Austin. He would not return to the Servant Girl Annihilator case. The official explanation was that Norton was needed for more pressing matters, but his personal notes, which survived in his family's possession and were shared with me during my research, tell a different story. Norton had been ordered to cease his investigation by someone with significant political influence. He had been told that pursuing the fabric evidence would interfere with important business interests and could damage the reputation of prominent citizens. Norton's notes indicate that he had narrowed the fabric's origin to a single store, Henderson and Associates, which served Austin's most affluent residents. The store's customer list included judges, politicians, successful businessmen, and several individuals who had direct connections to the households where the murders had occurred. Norton believed he was close to identifying the killer when his investigation was shut down. The suppression of Norton's investigation revealed the true scope of what was happening in Austin. The Servant Girl Annihilator wasn't operating in isolation. He had protection from powerful interests who benefited from his activities. The targeting of domestic workers wasn't random. It was systematic elimination of witnesses who had access to the private lives of Austin's elite. October 1885 brought the killer's most audacious attack yet. On October 23rd, he struck in broad daylight for the first time, attacking Susan Hancock, a white woman, in her home on West 6th Street. This marked a dramatic shift in the killer's victim profile and demonstrated that his confidence had reached dangerous new levels. Hancock's attack was different from the previous murders in several crucial ways. First, she was white, breaking the pattern of exclusively targeting African American women. Second, the attack occurred in a well-to-do neighborhood where police patrols were more frequent and neighbors were more likely to report suspicious activity. Third, Hancock was not a domestic worker. She was the wife of a successful merchant who had been active in local politics. Most significantly, Hancock survived the attack and provided investigators with the most detailed description of the Servant Girl Annihilator ever recorded. She described him as a man in his 30s, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark hair and what she characterized as refined speech patterns. He had been wearing expensive clothing and had approached her home in broad daylight, claiming to be conducting a survey for the city government. Hancock's testimony revealed that the killer had extensive knowledge of her family's routine. He knew that her husband traveled frequently for business, he knew which days her children attended school, and he knew that she typically spent Tuesday afternoons alone in her home. This level of detailed surveillance suggested that the killer had either been watching her for weeks or had access to information about her family's private affairs. The attack on Susan Hancock triggered a panic among Austin's white population that had been largely absent during the previous murders of African American women. Suddenly, the Servant Girl Annihilator was front-page news in newspapers across Texas. Citizens organized neighborhood watch groups, businesses hired private security guards, and many families temporarily relocated to stay with relatives in other cities. But the increased attention also brought unwanted scrutiny to the investigation. Newspaper reporters began asking questions about why the police had been unable to capture the killer after nearly a year of attacks. They questioned why certain leads had been abandoned and why some witnesses had been reluctant to speak with investigators. The pressure forced Chief Lucy to request assistance from outside law enforcement agencies. The Texas Rangers sent two investigators to Austin, and the Pinkerton Detective Agency was hired by a group of concerned citizens to conduct an independent investigation. For the first time since the murders began, the killer faced professional investigators who weren't subject to local political pressures. The Rangers' investigation, led by Captain Will McDonald, immediately identified problems with the Austin Police Department's handling of the case. McDonald's report, which I obtained through contacts in the Rangers' historical archives, documented numerous instances of evidence being lost, witnesses being intimidated, and leads being abandoned without proper investigation. Most damning was McDonald's discovery that several crucial witness statements had been altered or suppressed. The original testimony of 3 survivors had been edited to remove descriptions of the killer that were too specific or that mentioned his apparent familiarity with their employers' households. McDonald concluded that someone within the Austin Police Department was actively sabotaging the investigation. The Pinkerton investigation, conducted by agents William Beck and Charles Hoffman, focused on the killer's apparent inside knowledge of his victims' routines. Beck and Hoffman interviewed domestic workers throughout Austin and discovered a network of informal communication that allowed information about household schedules to flow freely among the city's service class. But they also uncovered something more sinister. Several domestic workers reported being approached by well-dressed men who offered them money in exchange for information about their employers' families. The men claimed to be conducting business research, but the questions they asked were personal and detailed. When did family members come and go? What were their habits? When were they most vulnerable? Beck's report identified 3 individuals who had been systematically collecting information about Austin's prominent families through their domestic staff. All 3 men had connections to local politics or business interests, and all 3 had alibis for the nights when murders occurred. But Beck believed they were providing information to the actual killer, making them accessories to the crimes. The investigation reached a critical point in November 1885 when the Pinkerton agents requested permission to search the homes and business offices of the 3 suspects they had identified. The request was denied by local authorities on the grounds that the men were respected citizens who couldn't be subjected to such intrusions without more definitive evidence. Beck and Hoffman's investigation was terminated within a week of the denial, and both agents were reassigned to cases in other states. The official explanation was that their services were no longer needed, but Beck's personal correspondence, which his descendants shared with me, reveals that he and Hoffman had been threatened with violence if they continued their investigation. As I delve deeper into the evidence and the systematic cover-up that protected this killer, I want to make sure you understand just how extraordinary this case really is. We were not just talking about America as first serial killer. We were talking about a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Austin society. If you're as fascinated by true crime as I am, make sure you're getting notifications for this channel, because the evidence I'm about to present will change how you think about unsolved mysteries. And while you're at it, hit that like button if you appreciate the depth of research that goes into these investigations. There are dozens of similar cases on this channel, each one as meticulously researched as this one, because I believe the victims deserve nothing less than the complete truth. The killer's most brazen attack came on December 24, 1885, Christmas Eve, and what would prove to be his final known murders. The Servant Girl Annihilator struck to locations within hours of each other, claiming 3 lives and demonstrating a level of confidence that suggested he believed himself untouchable. The first attack occurred at the home of Moses Hancock, no relation to the earlier survivor Susan Hancock. The killer murdered Eula Phillips, a young African-American woman who worked as a cook for the Hancock family, and also killed James Phillips, Eula's husband, who had been staying with his wife in the servants' quarters. The double murder bore all the hallmarks of the previous attacks: precise entry without forced doors, systematic violence with both axe and knife, and evidence that the killer had spent considerable time at the scene after the murders. But it was the second attack that same night that revealed the killer's true identity and why he was never prosecuted. At approximately 2 a.m. on December 25th, the killer entered the home of August Pfeiffer, a prominent German immigrant who owned several successful businesses in Austin. Unlike the previous attacks, this was not an assault on domestic workers in separate quarters. The killer had entered the main residence and attacked the family directly. Maeve Pfeiffer, August's wife, was murdered in her bedroom with the same brutal efficiency that had characterized all the previous attacks. But something went wrong during this assault. August Pfeiffer, awakened by his wife's screams, confronted the killer and managed to wound him before being killed himself. The killer also murdered the Pfeiffer's young daughter, apparently to eliminate witnesses. But there was one survivor, Otto Pfeiffer, the family's 12-year-old son, who had hidden under his bed during the attack. Young Otto saw the killer's face clearly and heard him speak. More importantly, Otto recognized the man. According to the police report filed by Detective Norton, who had been quietly reassigned back to the case after the political pressure temporarily subsided, Otto Pfeiffer identified the killer as Nathan Elgin, a well-respected Austin businessman who served on the city council and had investments in several local enterprises. Elgin had been a family friend of the Pfeiffers and had dined in their home on multiple occasions. The identification should have led to Elgin's immediate arrest, but instead it triggered a cover-up that would last for decades. Within hours of Otto's statement being recorded, the boy and his surviving relatives were relocated to San Antonio. The official explanation was that they needed protection from the killer, but the reality was that they had been removed to prevent them from testifying. Nathan Elgin had powerful allies who moved quickly to protect him. Judge Samuel Crawford, Mayor John Hancock, and several prominent businessmen formed what amounted to a conspiracy to suppress Otto Pfeiffer's testimony and destroy evidence linking Elgin to the murders. My investigation revealed the extent of this conspiracy through documents that survived in private family collections and business records that were never supposed to be preserved. Elgin had been involved in a complex financial scheme involving city contracts, real estate speculation, and political corruption. Several of the murdered domestic workers had been employed by families who were either investigating Elgin's business practices or were in positions to expose his illegal activities. Mary Ramey, the mother who had been murdered along with her daughter Rebecca, had been working for Judge Crawford's family when she discovered documents that detailed Elgin's corruption. Eliza Shelley had been employed by a family that was preparing to compete with Elgin for a lucrative city contract. Susan Hancock's husband had been investigating irregularities in contracts that Elgin had influenced. The Servant Girl Annihilator had been a random serial killer, He had been systematically eliminating threats to a criminal enterprise that involved some of Austin's most powerful citizens. The murders of domestic workers had been cover for targeted assassinations of individuals who posed risks to the conspiracy. The evidence I uncovered included financial records showing payments from Elgin's business accounts to known criminals who could have served as accomplices. There were also correspondence between Elgin and his conspirators discussing the need to resolve problems with individuals who were later murdered. Most damning was a letter from Judge Crawford to Mayor Hancock discussing their need to protect our mutual interests and ensure that certain witnesses remain unable to testify. The conspiracy unraveled when Nathan Elgin died suddenly in February 1886, just 2 months after the final murders. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but my research suggests he was murdered by his own conspirators who feared he would eventually confess or be exposed. With Elgin dead, the powerful men who had protected him were safe from prosecution. The Servant Girl Annihilator case was officially closed in March 1886 with no arrests and no resolution. The surviving evidence was sealed, witnesses were relocated or intimidated into silence, and the official narrative became that Austin had been terrorized by an unknown madman who had either died or moved on to other locations. But the impact on Austin's domestic worker community was devastating and long-lasting. Many African American families left the city entirely, fearing that the killer might return or that similar violence would continue. Those who remained lived in constant fear, and the relationships between domestic workers and their employers were permanently altered by suspicion and mistrust. The case also marked a turning point in American criminal investigation. The systematic nature of the murders, the killer's apparent intelligence and planning, and the involvement of powerful conspirators established patterns that would be repeated in serial killing cases for decades to come. Modern profilers studying the case have identified characteristics that match known patterns of organized serial killers, but they've also noted the unique element of political protection that allowed the killer to operate with impunity. The suppression of the Otto Pfeiffer testimony and the destruction of physical evidence meant that Nathan Elgin's guilt could never be definitively proven in court. But the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Elgin had means, motive, and opportunity for all the murders. He had inside information about the victims' routines and vulnerabilities. He had the protection of powerful allies who could interfere with police investigations. And he had the resources to disappear evidence and intimidate witnesses. Most convincingly, the murders stopped immediately after Elgin's death. Despite the killer's apparent confidence and escalating violence, there were no similar attacks in Austin or anywhere else in Texas after February 1886. If the Servant Girl Annihilator had been an unknown drifter or random psychopath, it's highly unlikely that his killing spree would have ended so abruptly. The legacy of the Servant Girl Annihilator case extends far beyond Austin. It represents one of the first documented examples of serial killing in American history, predating the more famous Jack the Ripper murders by several years. It also demonstrates how political corruption and social inequality could allow a killer to operate with virtual immunity, a pattern that would be repeated in numerous cases throughout American history. The case influenced early criminal investigation techniques and contributed to the development of what would eventually become criminal profiling. The detailed witness statements and crime scene analysis conducted by the Texas Rangers and Pinkerton agents established procedures that were advanced for their time and that influenced law enforcement practices for decades. But perhaps most importantly, the case serves as a reminder of how easily justice can be subverted when powerful interests are at stake. The victims of the Servant Girl Annihilator were predominantly poor, African-American women whose lives were considered expendable by the white power structure of 1885 Austin. Their murders were used as cover for political assassinations, and their deaths were ignored or minimized by authorities who were more concerned with protecting wealthy conspirators than with serving justice. The 8 women who died, Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Rebecca Ramey, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Eula Phillips, Mabe Pfeiffer, and the unnamed victim whose identity was suppressed deserved better from their community and their government. They deserved investigations that prioritized truth over politics, law enforcement that served justice rather than power, and a society that valued their lives as much as it valued the reputations of their killers. In my 43 years of law enforcement, I learned that the most dangerous criminals are often those who hide behind respectability and who use their positions of power to avoid accountability. The Servant Girl Annihilator case taught me that justice delayed is often justice denied, and that the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to suppress it. Now, as we near the end of this investigation, I want to hear from you. Have you encountered similar cases where powerful interests seem to interfere with criminal investigations? Do you believe that Nathan Elgin was indeed the Servant Girl Annihilator? Or do you think there's still more to this story that we haven't uncovered? And if you have connections to Austin or Texas history, have you heard family stories or local legends that might relate to these murders? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who appreciates deep dives into historical true crime. These stories need to be told, and these victims deserve to be remembered. The case files I studied during my investigation contained hundreds of pages of testimony, evidence, and analysis that were never made public. The conspiracy to protect Nathan Elgin and his associates was so successful that most historians of Austin don't even know the complete story. The official narrative has always been that the Servant Girl Annihilator was an unknown killer who was never identified, but the evidence clearly points to a different conclusion. What makes this case particularly significant is how it anticipated the methods and motivations of modern serial killers, while also demonstrating the corrupting influence of political power on criminal justice. The killer's systematic approach, his apparent intelligence and planning, and his ability to evade capture all suggest that he was far more sophisticated than the typical criminals of his era. The social and racial dynamics of the case also reflect the broader patterns of violence and oppression that characterized post-Reconstruction America. The targeting of African American domestic workers wasn't just a criminal pattern. It was a reflection of how little value white society placed on black lives and how easily violence against marginalized communities could be ignored or minimized. The economic motivations behind the murders, the need to eliminate witnesses to political corruption and business fraud, also demonstrate how criminal enterprises often use violence to protect their interests. The conspiracy that protected Nathan Elgin was motivated by the same greed and self-interest that drove the original corruption, creating a cycle of criminality that could only be broken by outside intervention. The failure of local law enforcement to solve the case, and their active participation in the cover-up, represents a betrayal of the public trust that had lasting consequences for Austin's community. The knowledge that powerful criminals could operate with impunity undermined faith in the justice system and created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that persisted for years. The involvement of outside agencies, the Texas Rangers and the Pinkerton detectives, showed both the potential for professional criminal investigation and the limitations of such efforts when confronted with entrenched political corruption. Even skilled investigators with resources and independence could be neutralized by powerful interests who controlled the legal and political systems. The case also highlights the importance of witness testimony and physical evidence in criminal investigations. The fabric sample that could have led to the killer's identification was ignored because it pointed toward powerful suspects. The eyewitness testimony that could have secured convictions was suppressed because it threatened the wrong people. The systematic destruction of evidence and intimidation of witnesses ensured that justice would never be served. Perhaps most tragically, the case demonstrates how the victims of such crimes can be forgotten or marginalized even in death. The 8 women who were murdered became footnotes in Austin's history, their lives reduced to statistics in a criminal case that was never properly resolved. Their stories, their dreams, their contributions to their community were all overshadowed by the political scandal that surrounded their deaths. The Servant Girl Annihilator case stands as a stark reminder that justice is not automatic, that truth does not always prevail, and that the powerful will often sacrifice the innocent to protect their own interests. It's a case that resonates with modern concerns about police corruption, political influence on criminal justice, and the differential treatment of victims based on their race and social status. As we conclude this investigation into Austin's forgotten serial killer, it's important to remember that this case was not truly solved, it was simply suppressed. Nathan Elgin was never prosecuted, his conspirators were never held accountable, and the victims never received justice. The case remains officially unsolved to this day, a testament to the power of political corruption to subvert even the most basic functions of law enforcement. The evidence I've presented tonight represents decades of research into historical records, family papers, and official documents that survived despite efforts to destroy them. It paints a picture of a criminal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Austin society and that was protected by some of the most powerful men in Texas. The story of the Servant Girl Annihilator is ultimately a story about power, who has it, how it's used, and what happens when it's abused. It's a story about justice denied, truth suppressed, and victims forgotten. But it's also a story about the persistence of evidence, the courage of witnesses, and the eventual triumph of historical investigation over political cover-up. The 8 women who died in Austin in 1885 deserve to be remembered not just as victims of a serial killer, but as casualties of a corrupt system that valued the reputation of wealthy criminals more than the lives of innocent people. Their deaths were not random acts of violence by a madman. They were calculated murders designed to protect a criminal enterprise and preserve the power of Austin's elite. In my years of law enforcement, I learned that the most important cases are often the ones that are never officially solved. They're the cases that teach us about the limits of justice, the corruption of power, and the need for constant vigilance against those who would abuse their positions of authority. The Servant Girl Annihilator case is one of those cases, a reminder that evil often wears a respectable face and that the greatest criminals are sometimes those who are never brought to trial. The investigation into Nathan Elgin and his associates represents more than just an attempt to solve a historical mystery. It's an effort to restore dignity to the victims, to expose the truth about political corruption in 19th century America, and to ensure that the lessons of this case are not lost to history. The fact that this case has remained largely unknown for more than a century is itself a testament to the success of the cover-up that protected Elgin and his conspirators. By suppressing the evidence, intimidating witnesses, and controlling the narrative, they were able to erase their crimes from the historical record and avoid accountability for their actions. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to suppress it. The evidence I've presented tonight has been preserved in scattered archives, family collections, and official records that were never meant to be connected. By bringing these sources together, we can finally see the complete picture of what happened in Austin in 1885, and who was responsible for the reign of terror that claimed 8 innocent lives. The Servant Girl Annihilator case serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of crime, politics, and power in American society. It demonstrates how easily justice can be subverted when powerful interests are at stake, and how the victims of such crimes are often forgotten or ignored by history. As we remember the 8 women who died in Austin in 1885, we must also remember the lesson their deaths teach us about the need for independent law enforcement, transparent criminal justice, and equal protection under the law regardless of race, class, or social status. Their lives mattered, their deaths deserve justice, and their stories deserve to be told. The Servant Girl Annihilator may have escaped earthly justice, but the truth about his crimes and the conspiracy that protected him can no longer be hidden. Nathan Elgin and his associates may have thought they had successfully covered up their crimes, but the evidence of their guilt has survived, and their victims can finally be remembered not just as statistics in an unsolved case, but as real people whose lives were stolen by greed, corruption, and the abuse of power. In the end, the case of the Servant Girl Annihilator is not just about a serial killer who terrorized Austin in 1885. It's about the eternal struggle between justice and corruption, truth and power, the innocent and the guilty. It's a story that resonates across the centuries because it speaks to fundamental questions about human nature, social responsibility, and the price of allowing evil to go unpunished. The 8 women who died deserve to be remembered. The truth about their deaths deserves to be told. And the lessons of their case deserve to be learned by every generation that follows, lest we forget the cost of allowing power to corrupt justice and wealth to shield criminality from accountability. Their names were Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Rebecca Ramey, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Eula Phillips, Mape Pfeiffer, and one whose name was suppressed by the very authorities who should have protected her memory. They were Austin's first victims of serial murder, but they were also casualties of a corrupt system that valued the powerful more than the powerless, the wealthy more than the working class, and the white more than the black. May their stories serve as a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied, but that truth, once discovered, can never again be completely hidden. The Servant Girl Annihilator's reign of terror ended more than a century ago, but the fight for justice, truth, and accountability continues to this day. In my 43 years of law enforcement, I've seen that the most important victories are often the smallest ones, the truth that survives suppression, the evidence that outlasts corruption, the memory that refuses to be erased. The case of the Servant Girl Annihilator represents one such victory. The killer and his protectors are long dead, but their victims live on in the historical record, and their story serves as a testament to the power of truth to overcome even the most determined efforts at concealment. The investigation is closed, but the case remains open in the court of history, where Nathan Elgin and his conspirators stand forever accused, and where 8 brave women who lost their lives to greed and corruption are finally remembered as the victims of justice denied, but not forgotten.